if the roles were reversed.
Would Marsellus Wallace save Butch? Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about the classic Tarantino film Pulp Fiction, which I think is one of his best. So before I go into it, if this is the first time you've been to my channel, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. Now, I love film. I make no secret of that, and I love talking about films. And sometimes I could just be sitting down thinking about scenarios, thinking about if certain things happened or certain things didn't happen in film. And this was the first one that I'm going to talk about. So, like I said in the title, would Marsellus Wallace have saved Butch? And just to elaborate on that, would Marsellus Wallace have saved Butch if the roles was reversed? Now, if you've never seen Pulp Fiction or you need a reminder about the actual situation, here it is. But before I do, I need to give you the players of the situation, the main people that we're going to be talking about, and their roles, why they got into that situation, and what happened. So first of all, we're going to talk about Butch Coolidge. Now, Butch is played by Bruce Willis. Now, Butch is a boxer. He has a meeting with Marsellus Wallace. Do you remember that famous scene where you see the back of Marsellus Wallace's head? And if you remember, in that meeting, he's basically told that he needs to throw the fight. He needs to basically go down. I can't remember what round it is. And he repeats it to Marsellus. So he's paid to throw the fight, and that's basically what should have happened. Now, the second person that I'm going to have to talk about clearly is Marsellus Wallace. Now, we all know Marsellus Wallace, played brilliantly by Ving Rhames. I hope I pronounced that right. It could be Rhymes, but Ving Rhames. Now, you don't see too much of Marsellus Wallace in the film, but we know that he's a man not to be crossed with. I mean, you think about the first conversation at the beginning of the film with Jules and Vincent, and they're talking about Rocky, I can't remember his surname, that he threw somebody out of the window, if you remember. So you know straight away that Marsellus Wallace is not somebody to play with. And when you do see Marsellus Wallace, you see him in the bar, he's got the plaster on his head, you don't see his face, so you have that sense of not foreboding, but you're thinking, who is this guy? You don't want to see his face, he's going to be somebody serious. Now, the third person that I'm going to talk about is Zed. Now, Zed is, I'm not sure if he's actually a police officer. Some people list him as a police officer. I've looked at his uniform, it looks like it's some form of security. Either way, he's in some position of authority, and he goes to the shop after being called, and he's the one that carries out an act on Marsellus Wallace. Sadly, if you are familiar with any of my content, you know that I recently done a video on Peter Green, who is the actor that played Zed and sadly passed away. And then the last person that I'm going to briefly touch on because he's there is Maynard. So he's played by an actor called Dwayne Whitaker. And he is the owner. So he's the person that is at the front of the store. Butch and Marsellus go into the store. He basically deals with them and he calls Zed. So he is basically Zed's underling, Zed's, minion, if that's a fair sort of observation. And actually, really and truly, for completeness, the fifth person I'm going to mention, there was a fifth person there, wasn't there? The Gimp. Now, he doesn't have a name, he doesn't speak, so you hear him sort of moan behind the mask before Butch knocks him out. So those are the main players of the scenario. So let's talk about the scenario. So like I said, Butch is paid by Marsellus to throw the fight. He doesn't throw the fight, and as a result, Marsellus is looking for Butch to basically deal with him, and it looks like he wants to find him and unalive him. Butch goes back to his apartment to retrieve the watch, and obviously while he's there, he takes care of Vincent. Now, he's driving back to where he needs to get to, and who happens to cross the road as he's there? Marsellus Wallace. Marsellus Wallace recognizes him, and then if you remember, Butch drives his car into Marsellus. They both are injured. Then Marsellus Wallace is chasing Butch down the street. He tries to hit him with his weapon a number of times. Eventually, they go into the shop. Butch basically starts unloading on him with his fists, and then Maynard knocks both of them out. Knocks Butch out. Marsellus at that point is almost out anyway. They wake up and they're tied up in the basement. So they're in the basement. They're tied up in the basement. They got their gags in their mouth, and the situation is looking a bit off. Like, what's going on here? Right, then Zed comes, and then he does that eeny, meeny, miny, mo. It falls on Marsellus. Marsellus gets taken to the back room, and then the music starts, and we sort of know what happens. Butch manages to free himself, knocks out the Gimp, and then goes upstairs to leave. And as he goes to leave, he could hear Maynard, well, probably more Zed, making noises like yeehaw, etc. Obviously celebrating or enjoying the fact that they're doing something horrible to Marsellus Wallace. So Butch opens the door, and I honestly think it was hearing that sound, it was hearing them sort of enjoying themselves, made him think, you know what, he needs to go back. So if you remember, he picks a number of different weapons. Off my head, I haven't seen Pulp Fiction in a little while, but obviously he picks up the chainsaw, he picks up the hammer, he picks up something else as well, but then he settles on the samurai sword. Goes back down, opens the door, and as it opens the door, you see exactly what is going on. Zed's doing what he's doing, Maynard is watching him, and then Maynard turns around, senses Butch behind him, he gets dealt with, and then ultimately Marsellus Wallace gets up, remember that whole that part in slow motion, and he shoots Zed. So, going back to my question, if the roles were reversed, if everything happened differently, so let's go back to the eeny, meeny, miny, mo. We go back to that situation, and it falls on Butch. Butch gets taken into the room, right? Marsellus manages to free himself, right? What do you think would have happened? Do you think Marsellus would have saved Butch? Let's think about the scenario. Would it have played out exactly like the scenario with Butch? Have a think about it for a second. So, Marsellus Wallace, he frees himself, knocks out the gimp. What do you think he would have done at that point? Because would he have done what Butch did and tried to leave and gone upstairs, tried to leave? Or do you think Marsellus Wallace, maybe being a hothead, would have gone straight into that room and tried to deal with them? I don't know. That's the first question. I'm going to say he's going to go upstairs. You're going to try and get away from that situation, aren't you? But if you go back to why they were both there, Marsellus Wallace is looking for Butch. Butch didn't throw the fight, lost him the money. He's seen Butch. Butch has driven the car into Marsellus. So a lot of things have happened to Marsellus. So even if the roles were reversed, Marsellus Wallace is still pretty angry with Butch because he didn't throw the fight. He's then probably even more angry because Butch has run him over in the car. So at that point, do you think Marsellus Wallace would have turned around and said, no, I need to go back and deal with the guys, or I need to go back and deal with Butch? Because that could be another thing. If you think about it, would Marsellus have been happy leaving the situation as it was? Would he be satisfied that he's got his revenge on Butch by leaving him to be dealt with by Zed and Maynard? Or do you think he needs to go down and finish the job? Do you think that he maybe needs to go down and deal with Maynard and Zed? Because ultimately they could have had him in that situation. Obviously, I know they did, but we're talking if the roles were reversed. So he needs to go down and deal with them because ultimately he is the kingpin, he is the crime lord, he is the boss, and he's been tied up and gagged. So, would he want revenge there? So those are things to consider. I mean, do you think if he was exactly where Butch was, just about to leave the store or the shop, and then he hears them sort of celebrating, making noises in glee about what they're doing, do you think that would have tipped him to make him think, nah, do you know what, I'm not having it, I need to go back and I'm going to go deal with them? So those are the things to consider. And I mean, I have considered it, I've considered it for a long time, or considered it for a while before making this video. And I mean, it's one of those questions nobody's gonna know the answer. I mean, you could probably go and ask Quentin Tarantino. I wonder what he would think. But this is what I think. So first of all, what I will say is that I love conversation. I love talking about things. So in the comments, let me know your thoughts. If you don't agree with me, if you think, I'm talking rubbish and Marsellus Wallace would have just, done something differently, let me know, because it's good to see or hear people's viewpoints. But this is what I think would have happened. So we're going to talk like the scenario happened. Like I said, he's managed to escape, he's knocked out the gimp, and he's gone upstairs. So he's gone upstairs. So some people may think, like I said, that he would have turned around and gone straight into that room, charging and dealt with Zed and Maynard then. But just say he's gone upstairs. I think he would have gone back. I think he would have gone back to Maynard and Zed. However, I do also think he wouldn't have saved Butch. I think he would have dealt with them because the fact that he's been tied up and he's been gagged, I think that wouldn't have sat well with him at all, and I think he would have dealt with them. But I also think that he wouldn't have let Butch live. That's my gut feeling, and I think in the film, the proper version, he lets Butch live because Butch saves him ultimately. Because you could then argue, what would Maynard of Zed have done after they had finished with Marsellus? Do you think they would have let him live? But that's what I think. So that is my thing. So as I said, let me know your thoughts. But I personally think if the roles were reversed, Marsellus Wallace would have gone back. He would have dealt with Zed. He would have dealt with Maynard. He also would have dealt with Butch. So I'm going to try and do these videos, especially on a film or TV series that has its anniversary. If you're familiar with any of my videos, you know that I always do a short on any anniversary of any films or TV series that I like. So if there's any that I come across which I think could do with a video like this, I will simply make it, put it on and let people give their opinion on what they think. So I'm really, really curious, as this is the first one, you know, I'll say it as it is, as this is the first one, I'm really, really curious to see what people think in terms of Pulp Fiction, the scenario that I've presented, and if people agree with what I think would have happened. If there's any alternate ones that hasn't been mentioned, I'm really, really curious to hear. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, if you could subscribe, if you could like, please comment, because as I said, I'll always reply to every comment. And I look forward to seeing you on the next film that we discuss. I wonder what it's going to be.